To understand the concept of acoustic impedance, it is necessary to understand the phenomenon of sound once it enters the outer ear. When sound waves are channeled into the external auditory meatus, they progress until reaching the eardrum. Here they exert varying pressures on the eardrum, setting it into motion. At the eardrum, part of the energy of sound is reflected, but most of it produces a vibration, which in effect is a displacement of this membrane. This displacement equals a given volume of space. To an extent, the eardrum is resistant to movement and opposes the changes in sound pressure. This opposition to change is the acoustic impedance of the ear. Therefore, acoustic impedance may be thought of as the resistance of a surface, such as the eardrum, to move because of sound pressure changes. It also represents opposition by a surface to the flow of acoustic energy through that surface. Terkelsen and Scott Nielsen found that this resistance is determined by the amount of energy absorbed by the eardrum and through the phase of the reflected sound wave. Now, under normal conditions, only a small portion of the acoustic energy transmitted to the eardrum is absorbed by the middle ear. Most of the energy enters the cochlea, a fact that contributes to the high sensibility of the auditory system. Regardless of the efficiency of the system, however, a certain amount of energy is always reflected from the membrane back into the ear canal. This reflected energy forms a wave that is propagated from the eardrum outwards. Its frequency is identical to that of the incoming or incident wave. Its amplitude and phase depend on the acoustic conditions encountered at the eardrum. The conditions are controlled by the properties of the middle ear. That is, the eardrum, the ossicular chain, the muscles and ligaments, the two cochlear windows, the cavity itself, and its cells. Thus, the wave reflected at the eardrum carries information concerning the state of the middle ear. The acoustic impedance of the ear is dependent primarily upon the mobility of the middle ear system, which is dictated by the effects of three components. The first one is stiffness, the second one is mass, and the third is resistance. Now, stiffness is introduced by the eardrum, the ligament and muscles of the middle ear, the volume of the air in the middle ear cavity, and the two cochlear windows. The mass is determined primarily by the weight of the ossicular chain and its muscles and attachments. In the normal ear, this is reduced to a minimum by the balance of the ossicular chain around its axis of rotation. The third component, resistance, is contributed mainly by the input impedance of the cochlea and to some extent by the frictional resistance of the ossicles. Now, when the middle ear mechanism is unusually stiff, as with stapes fixation and otosclerosis, the membrane presents a greater than normal resistance to movement. That is, it is less compliant. Little sound energy is transmitted through the system, and an abnormally large amount is reflected back from the membrane. At the other extreme, in an ear with an interrupted ossicular chain, the membrane is highly compliant, moving with an unusual degree of freedom. Now, in this case, a large amount of energy is accepted by the drum and less is reflected into the ear canal. On one hand, the otosclerotic ear presents a high impedance to incoming sound waves. By comparison, the ear with an interrupted ossicular chain shows an extremely low acoustic impedance. Both represent characteristic and identifiable conditions that result from specific changes within the middle ear conductive mechanism. Any impairment of the middle ear mechanism reduces the efficiency of the drum and the sound conducting system and results in a conductive hearing loss. Because the reduction in sensitivity is due to an unusual mechanical impedance of sound transmission, these losses are called impedance losses. Now, two types of acoustic impedance help to assess the status of middle ear function. Absolute acoustic impedance evaluates the ability of sound to transfer from the outer to inner ear via the middle ear. This entails measuring middle ear pressure, the ear cavity volume, and acoustic impedance in the plane of the eardrum. Relative acoustic impedance is concerned with the effect of the middle ear muscles on sound transmission. The reflex which results from the contractions of the interaural muscles is measured. The two small muscles, the stapedius and tensor tympani in the middle ear, provide the muscular attachments for the ossicular chain. Through reflex contraction of these muscles, the mechanical characteristics of the ear may be altered. Contraction of the stapedius muscle results in pulling the stapes in a lateral and inferior direction, acting through the incus and malleus. This contraction causes an increased tension and slight change in the position of the tympanic membrane. Contraction of the tensor tympani results in a medial and anterior pull on the malleus nearly at right angles to the course of the ossicular chain, also altering the position and tension of the tympanic membrane. Several methods have been proposed for measuring absolute acoustic impedance in the ear. And for a variety of reasons, most methods are inappropriate except for laboratory use. Some involve very time-consuming procedures, while others are either unreliable or require tedious calculations to determine impedance values. Except for the mechanical acoustic bridge developed by Wisłocki in 1957 and a more recently developed electroacoustic instrument by Terkelson and Scott Nielsen, all approaches to absolute acoustic impedance measurement have proven impractical for routine clinical use. Terkelson and Scott Nielsen write that the first systematic study of the human ear was made by Troger in 1930. He invented a mechanical bridge by which acoustic impedance is measured. And it was in 1946 that Mentz clinically employed Schuster's mechanical bridge in measuring acoustic impedance. The scope of his work was mainly to compare impedances in normal and pathological ears. The Wislocky acoustic bridge is based upon the same principles as the one used by Metz many years ago. However, certain changes have made it more clinically useful. In this first slide, we are looking at an examiner holding the acoustic bridge against the ear of the subject. The examiner's hand, the acoustic bridge, held against the examiner's ear. In the second slide, we'll take a look at a schematic diagram of the Wislocky acoustic bridge. The bridge itself consists of a miniature electroacoustic transducer labeled E. That point is right here. It is mounted between two tubes, tube A and tube B. Tube A, tube B. These tubes are connected by another tube Y, which is mounted here, and it bridges the transducer. A third branch of tube Y leads to the examiner's ears. Tube Y leading to the examiner's ears. In testing, tube A is connected to the ear canal via a speculum fitted with a soft plastic tip. They would be located right here. This permits an airtight coupling with the ear canal. Tube B leads to an adjustable cavity V1. It represents a predetermined volume of air that compensates for the volume of the ear canal between the eardrum and the tip of the speculum and bridge. This volume is critical for absolute measurements at the eardrum. Through a narrow airspace, V1 communicates with V2. V1 communicates with V2, which is another cavity of variable volume. RA, which represents the air gap between V1 and V2, represents a variable resistance. For test purposes, the transducer E is coupled to an audiometer. It radiates sound waves of equal amplitude but opposite phase into these main tubes. When a probe tone, which emanates here and is introduced through tube A into the ear canal, it is partially reflected from the eardrum. The resultant waveform is a combination of the incidence and reflected waves. These waves are partially reflected at the ends of the tubes, one at the eardrum and the other at the opposite end. The pattern of the wave depends on the unknown impedance encountered by the sound at the eardrum. In tube B, which terminates in a variable resistance, V2 and RA, a similar condition exists. The tubes, the wave in tubes A and B, generate a secondary resistance, the amplitude and phase of which, of the reflective waves in tube B, can be modified so that when they mix in tube Y from tube A, the result is a null condition. So we have two waves, one from tube A, one from tube B. They gather at a point tube Y, and they result in a null or cancellation effect. Such a cancellation can be detected by listening through the stethoscope off of tube Y at this point right here. When this condition exists, the impedance at the end of tube B is equal to the unknown impedance of the eardrum in the middle ear, and may be read directly from the variable controls V2 and RA. V2 and RA. These independent controls yield measures of compliance expressed in cubic centimeters of equivalent air volume and resistance expressed in acoustic ohms. Now we will begin to explain some of the terminology and some of the equipment that will be necessary in order to use the Wysocki acoustic bridge. Before acoustic impedance measures can be determined clinically using the Wysocki acoustic bridge, the following test equipment and accessories are needed. One is a sound-treated test suite. Second is a padded examining table of full length. Third is the Grayson-Stadler-Wysocki acoustic bridge, a term that we have placed on the board for you. Also needed is a one-channel portable audiometer, in addition to a white noise generator, also listed on the blackboard. There are also, in addition to these pieces of equipment, accessories. One certainly is an overhead light source for the examiner. Another is a solution of 70% colored alcohol. Also included for the examiner must be petroleum jelly. And one final thing is a 2 cc calibrated syringe. Now, prior to the absolute acoustic impedance measurements, any cerumen must be removed from the ear canals, and this term has been placed on the board for you. No reliable measurement by any method can be achieved when the canal is completely or even partially filled or blocked by this wax or cerumen.